Good evening, everyone. My name is Tricia King-Mims. I'm the Executive Director of National Park Partners of Chickamauga, Chattanooga, and Moccasin Bend. Thank you so much for joining us as we kick off the 2024 Rita Vital Memorial Moccasin Bend Lecture Series with Dr. Timothy Smith of the University of Tennessee at Martin. The series was founded in 2006 by the Friends of Moccasin Bend, now combined with the Friends of Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park to create National Park Partners. The series has been underwritten from the beginning by longtime National Park advocate and now Tennessee State Representative for District 29, Mr. Greg Vital. Through his generous sponsorship, the lecture series is offered free to the public, featuring 3 speaking events each fall with subject matter experts sharing insights on topics related to national parks and conservation, indigenous culture and history, and Chattanooga's place in the U.S. Civil War. I'd like to take a moment to pause and remember Rita Vital, Greg's mother, who attended each and every one of the 53 events prior to this evening. I've asked my good friend and Greg's good friend, Mr. John Edwards, to say a few words in memory of the remarkable woman for whom the Moccasin Bend Lecture Series is hereafter memorialized. John.
Thank you, Tricia. What a wonderful honor this is to say something about my friend, Rita Vital. My wife and I just love Rita from the first time we met her. The Rita Vital Memorial Moccasin Bend Lecture Series. She was one of our greatest ambassadors. Do you know that she attended all 19 of these lectures? All 19. Now, I didn't know that till recently. So obviously, I've missed a few. But also, she happens to be the mother of our board of directors member, the illustrious 29th District State Representative Greg A. Vital. He, along with the Morning Point Senior Living and Memory Care Center, are the underwriters of this annual event. But first, I have a directive from my wife that I need to read her comments about Rita, or I can't come home. She said, "I love Rita. Each time I was in her presence, I was rewarded because she shared her knowledge, kindness, compassion for others, as well as her sense of humor and a sense of style. A grand lady is missed and forever will be remembered. Faith R. Edwards," that is my wife. We came to know Rita, the Rita Vital family, through association of this organization as well as the Chattanooga News Chronicle, where we and my wife and I have been publisher for 35 years. Mrs. Rita stole our hearts early on, wherever she was and in her presence. She was very relatable and easy to talk with. During easy conversation, she offered a wealth of advice and ideas tempered with such an air of wisdom that you would be captivated and compelled to listen as well as to learn, then glean from her many experiences. Our friend, we will miss Rita Vital.
Thank you, John. We miss Rita, but we know she's smiling down on us tonight, and she's with us in spirit. So Moccasin Bend is one of 6 units of Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park established through land donations from the city of Chattanooga, Hamilton County, and the state of Tennessee in 2004, creating the only national archaeological district in the country and to this day. And of course, Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park was the first Civil War battlefield to ever be preserved and remains the largest. Chattanooga's National Park legacy is truly an amazing historic and cultural resource, offering over 9,000 acres and 80 miles of trails to explore. The preserved lands tell the story of 12,000 years of continuous habitation on Moccasin Bend and the Civil War campaign for Chattanooga. In fact, this very week, the National Park Service commemorates the 161st anniversary of the Battle of Chickamauga with a series of ranger programs, hikes with the park historian, and even a battlefield bicycle tour sponsored by National Park Partners coming up this Saturday at 9:30 a.m. at Chickamauga Battlefield. This event and many more, including our October 14th community celebration of 20 years of Moccasin Bend and our lecture series event that evening in partnership with the National Trail of Tears Association Conference, can be found on our website, nppcha.org. While we are blessed locally to have a national park throughout and surrounding our city, more than 1 million visitors came to Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park in 2023 alone, providing an economic impact exceeding $87 million between visitor spending and private sector job creation. In addition to forming the stories that shaped our city, our national park continues to be a major contributor to our local economy and our quality of life. With us tonight is Park Superintendent Brad Bennett and Park Historian Jim Ogden. Please join me in thanking Brad and Jim and the National Park Service for their dedication to the stewardship, interpretation, and preservation of Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our sponsor, Greg Vidal, founder of the Moccasin Bend Lecture Series. Among his many other awards and recognitions, Greg was the recipient in 2008 of the highest honor of the former Friends of Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park, the Drew Haskins Jr. Award of Merit. He was also recently named Conservation Legislator of the Year in Tennessee, and just this past weekend celebrated the grand opening of the Greg A. Vidal Center for Natural Resources and Conservation at Cleveland State Community College. Greg and I have worked together for nearly 20 years, going back to the early days of the Chattanooga office of the Land Trust for Tennessee, collaborating with the National Parks Conservation Association, where Greg served as board chair for many years, enjoying his beautiful farm for the annual Blessing of the Buffalo, which, mark your calendars, is coming up on Saturday, October 19th. If you've never been to Greg's farm out there in Georgetown, it's absolutely beautiful. The Blessing of the Buffalo is tremendous, and go Vols that day, by the way. It's a big game. I'm grateful for our friendship and for the opportunity to do great conservation work together. Please join me in welcoming Greg Vidal.
Well, first of all, let me just say thank you for being here and supporting our national park. Not just this one in Chattanooga, but all our national parks. All 430 of them. A new one was created yesterday in Texas, Blackwell School, and it's an exciting opportunity for all of us to get out and visit those national parks. It's somewhat bittersweet tonight to think back 20 years ago when we conceived the idea of the lecture series. And this is where we first met, in this room. And the late Shelley Andrews and myself and Becky Browder and a couple others met at 212 Market. And we came up with this idea of a lecture series to bring people together to talk about conservation and education and enlightening people about the importance of bringing together the importance of protecting those special places and the stories associated with so many of our national parks. And to think back, 53 different lectures. We've had superintendents from other national parks. We've had the Secretary of Interior. We've had chiefs of Native American tribes, authors, just a wonderful selection of individuals over the years. And I must say that Mother really enjoyed it. She looked forward to it. Many times I picked her up, but other times she was always arranging 2 or 3 of her senior friends to come ride down with her, because this was a highlight in September, October, and November, and then holding court out in the lobby, whether it was here or over at the IMAX, and talking and being the last one to leave. It was something special to her, but she loved people, and she loved the stories of our country. Born in 1930 in New York City of immigrant parents, she would go to Germany and to southern France in the summertime as World War I was beginning to start. And when she turned 18, her and a girlfriend drove from New York City to California visiting national parks. And that's where her first love, 1948. And she would tell me about Badlands or Zion, but it was the 1948 version. There usually wasn't a visitor center, and they had a little tent, and they stayed there, and there was maybe 2,000 visitors. They were early national parks. But it fostered a love of those special public lands across the country, and she instilled it in myself and my sisters. And we were fortunate to be blessed to go to many national parks growing up. And for me, the journey has always continued. I do have my passport book. As you know, as many of you collect those passports at national parks and get your book stamped, and I'm at about 380 national park units now of the 430, although I used to think it was 401 was my total, but the last couple presidents have added some through executive order to the amount of national parks we now have. So those are special stories that needed to be saved and protected. So I encourage you to get out and visit national parks. Enough said. Mother would be honored that all of you are here. She would want you to continue the legacy of Moccasin Bend and Chickamauga, Chattanooga National Park and our American history. Good, bad, or indifferent. It's not red or blue, it's red, white, and blue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Greg. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Timothy Smith, Professor of History at the University of Tennessee at Martin. A special thanks to the UT Chattanooga Department of History for partnering on this event to welcome their colleague from UT Martin. Dr. Smith earned his Ph.D. from Mississippi State University in 2001 and currently teaches history. He is a veteran of the National Park Service, and in addition to numerous articles and essays, he is the author, editor, and co-editor of more than 20 books with several university and commercial presses. His books have won numerous book awards, and his trilogy on the American Civil War's Tennessee River Campaign with Fort Henry and Donelson, Shiloh, and Corinth, winning a total of 9 book awards. Dr. Smith recently finished a 5-volume study of the Vicksburg Campaign for the University of Press of Kansas, and a new study of Albert Sidney Johnston, wait a minute, that's better, for LSU Press. He resides with his wife, Kelly, and daughters, Mary Kate and Leah Grace in Adamsville, Tennessee. Welcome back to the lecture series, Dr. Smith.
Thank you very much for having me back. I think it was 2019 when I was here last time. I'm going to take this thing off so I can hold it and make sure. Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me now? Y'all remember that commercial? So many cell phone companies now. I don't remember which one it was, but it was one of those cell phone companies. But anyway, thank you for having me back. I always enjoy Chattanooga is such a wonderful city with all the history and all the tourism and everything. I love coming to Chattanooga. So thank you for having me back. What a wonderful honor to read a vital, the naming of the lecture series, and for all that your mother, wonderful memorial there. So, all right. Well, let's get started. What we're going to talk about tonight is Civil War battlefield preservation in Tennessee, from Shiloh to Fort Pillow. You've probably heard of those. We're going to look at several of those battlefields and talk about the preservation and look at how they came about. Now, when Tricia and I were talking about this, kind of getting our minds together, what we were going to do and all that, I asked her, I said, do you remember what I talked about 5 years ago? It's 2019, I think. I said, do you remember? And she said, no, and I said, I don't remember either. And we came to the conclusion, if we didn't remember what I talked about, surely you wouldn't remember. So all this may be completely new to you. Hope it is. If I cover some of the same ground that I did 5 years ago. How many of you were here 5 years? Oh, we're in trouble, Tricia. There are quite a few. That means you've got a lot of stalwarts out here that are dedicated to your series. That's a good thing. So we're going to reinforce what we said last time with what we're talking about tonight. So Civil War battlegrounds of Tennessee, from Shiloh to Fort Pillow. All right. In terms of battlefields, I don't know that anybody has just sat down and counted the number of battlefields, unless it would be Jim Ogden. Jim, have you ever, he probably's got a number right off the top of his head there. If you will remember the Ken Burns series, anybody remember the Ken Burns series from what, 1990, 91, right in that era? That series famously said that the Civil War was fought in 10,000 different places, 10,000 being a round number, I guess. It also said Abraham Lincoln died on April the 14th. So you can't go by everything that it says in that series, but by and large, a wonderful series. I watch it every once in a while just to rewatch it. But 10,000 battlefields, and we're going to talk about every single one of them tonight. I hope you brought a snack. Now, we're not going to talk about every single one of them. We're going to narrow it down, obviously, a little bit. The Tennessee Civil War Preservation Association. Anybody members of that? We got several folks. Tennessee Civil War Preservation Association, created in 1994, and we'll put that in a little bit of context later on. But they kind of work off of I believe it was 1993. Will, were you involved in the Civil War Advisory Commission thing? Yeah, probably so. The Congress asked for a study of Civil War battlefield sites, and the Civil War Advisory Commission came up with basically, I believe it's 122 sites in Tennessee that would fit the bill of some type of battle, whether it was a battle or an engagement or a skirmish or, two drunk soldiers taking pot shots at each other, I guess would constitute a battle, I'm not sure. But 122 sites. Out of those, apparently 38 are principal battlefields, the big ones that, the Battlefield Trust will deal with preservation at, and there's several things going on in Tennessee in terms of preservation. So you can narrow it down a lot of different ways. Actually, what I'm going to do tonight is narrow it down to about 12, or I think it's 11 actually, 11 battlefields. There were 12 slides. We also got miscommunicated about how many slides and battlefields there were, but we've been putting a lot of work into this, I assure you. We have. Anyway, about 11 major battlefields in Tennessee that we can deal with, and I'll talk a little bit about how they were preserved, when they were preserved, and kind of the context a little bit of when they came about. It all starts in 1890 at a place called Chattanooga. Anybody been to Chattanooga? Okay, y'all got to get with the program here this afternoon. I was lecturing today in class, and I was talking about the 1790s and American expansion and all that, and I talked about Kentucky joining the Union in 1792. And I asked, was anybody from Kentucky? And there were a couple of people, I lived in Kentucky. And been to Kentucky, yeah, a couple of more. And I said, the next state, 1796, Tennessee joined the Union. Anybody ever been to Tennessee? And only about 2 raised their hands. We're sitting in Tennessee. I said, how many of you are asleep? And a lot more hands went up when I asked about asleep. Well, it starts in Chattanooga. All of you have been to Chattanooga. Obviously, you're in Chattanooga right now. And the park, of course, became known as the Chickamauga-Chattanooga National Military Park. This was a major development in terms of preservation. Prior to this, you had only private entities doing the preservation work. You might have an association here or a group of veterans there or whatever, a little bit of congressional funding put in to do a study here or a study there or something like that. But the vast majority of the preservation work had been done at Gettysburg through a private association, the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association. And it was there that they could, decide what we're going to commemorate, what we're going to put a monument to, all of that, what we're not going to. They wouldn't let Confederates put many monuments up at Gettysburg, and part of the argument for making this national in scope was to commemorate both sides. And one of the early preservationists up there said visitors coming 100 years from now are going to ask, was there nobody that the Union Army was fighting? Who were they fighting? Were they just hitting air? Were they just poking air? So both sides were ultimately preserved at Gettysburg, but it starts again at Chattanooga in 1890 when Congress gets involved. And I call this period of preservation the golden age of battlefield preservation because all the stars seemingly line up when we get to the 1890s and get to this preservation effort. And we'll move on to our slides here. You see, we don't have a pointer. You use the battery up playing with the cat on this, didn't you? That's what we do mostly with pointers at our house. But you see Chattanooga down in the bottom there. You all know where Chattanooga is. We won't refer back to this map each time, but you can see the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. It's 11. We're on the same page here. You can see where Chattanooga and Cumberland Gap, Fort Donelson, all those are in terms of the map. It's interesting. I was looking at the map just a little bit, and you can see major corridors here, and this is completely off the topic of preservation. It gets more into the topic of the military campaigns. Look at where the major corridors are. Of course, you've got Fort Pillow over there on the Mississippi River. Now, there were battles at Memphis and elsewhere. We're not going to talk about them tonight. These are just the ones we're going to talk about. So that's one corridor, the Mississippi River. Fort Donelson down to Johnsonville, Shiloh, Davis Bridge, all that area. That's the Tennessee River Valley, and you could, Parker's Crossroads is even tied to that a little bit. So you've got a corridor there. Nashville, Stones River, Franklin, Chattanooga. You've got that Middle Tennessee corridor there along the, what's it called, Nashville and Chattanooga, Louisville and Nashville, whatever railroad, the different names at different stages of it, corridor there. Cumberland Gap up there, of course, we all know that gap through the mountains. What's the common denominator here in all of these military actions? Transportation routes, right? Rivers, rails, gaps through the mountains. So you can see why the battles wind up where they actually do, at least in this sense. I thought that was kind of interesting, just observing that. So here we are at Chattanooga. Y'all know that scene, don't you? That's beautiful. No other battlefield has anything like this. I think the story I read one time, some Prince Archduke somebody of Ferdinand, Austria, came over one time and was feted and all that. I think they took him to Chattanooga, and he just reveled over the beauty and the scenery and all that. And just a couple of years later, President Roosevelt came, and they took him up on Lookout Mountain and all that, and his thing was, there's an American prince here now, not a Austrian prince, there's an American prince here, but everybody revels over the beauty of Chattanooga there. But it's the formation of this park that you hold so dear around here, and well, you should. You have an absolute gem, and the National Park Service is doing an absolute wonderful job of taking care of it. But it's the beginning of this golden age movement when all these stars come together that allows for the best opportunity that we have ever had to preserve these battlefields. And this is kind of my soapbox a little bit, I probably talked about this 5 years ago. So if you remember anything about it, you'll probably remember this. But it's this time period where you have the veterans still alive. If you do the math from 1863 to, let's just say 1893, what's that, 30 years? I'm terrible at math. I think that's 30 years. If they were, let's say 25, 30, whatever, some lower level or younger ages, let's just say average of 25 years old, they're going to be getting up to 55 now, and they're starting to, maybe not pass on at that age, but they're starting to recognize their mortality, right? When you start getting into your 50s, you start thinking, and I know this by experience, there's a lot more already gone than there is in the future, And so they're thinking, we got to leave a legacy. We left our legacy, but we got to leave a tangible memorialization of that legacy. And so these veterans are still able to come back to the battlefields and go to specific points on the Chickamauga battlefield or the Chattanooga battlefield or Orchard Knob or Browns Ferry or wherever it is and say, this is where this occurred, this is where this happens. It's not going to be long until those 55, 60-year-old former soldiers are 70-year-old, 80-year-old are gone, and with them goes a wealth of information about what happened, right? So the time to preserve is now in the 1890s while these veterans are still able come back. A second factor in this, you also have veterans in Congress. I did a study one time. I went through every member of Congress, and this is Jim Ogden-like kind of thing, but I went through every member of Congress in every Congress in the 1890s and looked at their veteran status, whether they were a veteran of the Civil War or not. And what I found in the Congress, I forget which one it is, whatever Congress that established Chickamauga-Chattanooga National Battlefield, over 50% of the members of Congress were veterans of the Civil War. And so that shows you their interest in it, and they're willing to appropriate money to do this. As the 1890s Congresses evolved, that started going, and it shows the mortality. It started going down, and it was a lesser proportion each time to, I think, the end of the 1890s, it got down to like something in 20 or 30% were Civil War veterans. So the time for these veterans to appropriate money for what they were interested in and immortalize themselves, all of that is now, 1890s. Now, a third factor in this, in terms of the battlefields themselves, these battlefields are fairly pristine still in the 1890s. And you get whole fields like Chickamauga. Less in Chattanooga, of course, because Chattanooga by then is a fairly large city. But you haven't reached in most of these battlefields like Murfreesboro or Petersburg or Manassas, Washington, D.C., those at Fredericksburg, you haven't reached the point where these cities start to just mushroom and grow. You will see that just in a decade or two with the coming of the second industrial revolution, where automobiles, all that makes mobility easier, and as a result, you start spreading out into suburbs, all of that kind of stuff. Well, pretty soon, these battlefields are going to be engulfed in urbanization, in modernization, and they're going to be gone. So the time to do it is now. And fortunately, Congress acted, and in the 1890s created 5 national military parks. You know them well. 2 are actually in Tennessee, here at the Chattanooga wing of it, and over at Shiloh, which we'll talk about in just a second. But you have the others, Vicksburg in Mississippi, Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, and Antietam as a national battlefield in Maryland. And if you go to those today, those are the best marked battlefields. If you want to go find a monument to your ancestor, whatever regiment there, you can probably find it at one of those. Sadly, you go to Stones River, and we're going to talk about these established a little bit later on, Fort Donelson, Petersburg. What percentage of Petersburg's earthworks and all that are in the park? Do you have any idea? 15%? Small. I think Stones River is like 10% or less of the battlefield actually in the battlefield. Now, the Battlefield Trust and others, Park Service and Tennessee Civil War Preservation Association, all of these have been doing a lot of good work, and we've added to those numbers later on. But do you see how the time to do this is now? It's a window of opportunity in the 1890s, and fortunately Congress acted and created Chickamauga-Chattanooga National Military Park in 1890. It was the lead park, completely revolutionized how we do preservation. 1894, Shiloh is also established. I'm guessing everybody in here has been to Shiloh. If you haven't, you need to go. Come on over and take a look. It's very similar to Chickamauga. Very wooded, very well marked, very beautiful, pristine, all of that. So we've got these 1890s battlefields that were fortunately preserved. Unfortunately, there were others that were supposed to be preserved that weren't in the 1890s. Did you know there were, I counted it up again at some point, there were like 30 different battlefields. I think it was 30, I'd have to look back. But there were numerous battlefield park bills in Congress that were supposed to create, for instance, a Franklin National Military Park, a Perryville National Military Park, an Atlanta National Military Park. All of these battlefields that are, even, there's nothing hardly in Atlanta right now. Perryville's a state park. And there was supposed to be a Petersburg and a Manassas and all those that came later on, but are much smaller now because they were done later on. I'll explain why. So all of these battlefield bills were in Congress, offered, but they were never acted on. But these 5 fortunately were. I remember one of the coolest things I'd done at research Anybody ever researched at the National Archives? I know Will has. Anybody ever done the National Archives? Think of the most egregious government agency ever and multiply that times like 10. They are strictly government, do things, their own little way, and it's aggravating as it can be. The online catalog is an absolute dumpster fire. You can't find anything in the online catalog. All right, I'm not here to bash the National Archives, but what I'm here to tell you is that when you're looking for something, it takes a little more effort than you just type it in, and you can go to the shelves and find it or something like that. So I wanted to see these battlefield bills, the original bills, to see what could have been, like at Franklin. I wanted to know how big this Franklin National Military Park was going to be. And so I go talk to the legislative archivist, and I've learned a long time ago, well, I've learned in a lot of different ways, reverse psychology works. I lead a lot of tours. And if there are any bus drivers in here, I apologize, but I've learned how to deal with bus drivers. You never say, can you go up in there? Well, I probably shouldn't. I don't know if I could back out. What you say is, I want to go up in there, but I don't think you can get that bus in there. I don't think you can do it. Well, you watch and I bet I can. You watch me do it. And so I've learned how to deal with it. Archivist, if you say, I'm looking for this, but I don't think you can find it. I don't think, well, you just watch. You come on with me. And this archivist took me up in the catacombs of the National Archives and it's unreal up in that building, what all they have, and the quintessential stuffy old, volumes and all that kind of stuff. I well remember we passed up somewhere, I don't know where it was, on the way up there, and there were a bunch of boxes and shrink wrap and on pallets and all that, and he just made the reference, oh, we just got the Ted Kennedy papers. We haven't cataloged them yet, but we just got the Ted Kennedy papers. Oh, okay, Ted Kennedy. But we went up there, and we found this humongous leather-bound ledger that was dated like 1896 or whatever, the exact Congress and session that I was looking for. And we opened it up, and some of them, they weren't all the same size. It wasn't all the same pages, size pages and all that. Some of them were just handwritten. Some congressmen didn't even have it printed. It was just handwritten, his bill that he wanted to offer. But lo and behold, we found the Franklin National Military Park bill, and it was quite interesting. But what could have been, what could we have done had we created all of those national parks then? And they, fortunately did 5, but I think we kind of dropped the ball because it's so much more, infinitely more expensive now to do this. And the Civil War Trust or the Battlefield Trust, as much as they're doing, can't hardly keep up with costs now and all of that. So the Golden Age, bittersweet kind of, very good work, but could have done a lot more. Fortunately, they do the work here at Chickamauga, Chattanooga. Shiloh, boy, isn't that a pretty picture of Shiloh there? That's right at the Peach Orchard there, Harper's Battery, at Shiloh National Military Park. A little bit about, I know y'all are more interested probably than in Chickamauga and Chattanooga than you are anything, so I'll go into a little more detail about that. Chattanooga, the Chattanooga wing of the National Military Park is very important also in determining kind of a alternate way of preservation. The optimal way to do it is to go in and buy a whole battlefield, like at Chickamauga, right? Got the whole thing. At Shiloh, they got basically the whole thing. And we've been adding on a little bit here and there. But basically come in and buy the whole battlefield. Up at Chattanooga, you really couldn't do that, right? Because by then, urbanization had certainly started spilling across to Missionary Ridge and up Missionary Ridge. And so the founder, the person behind all of this, a guy named Henry Van Ness Boynton. Anybody heard of Boynton? B-O-Y-N-T-O-N, if I spell that right. Every time you step on a battlefield, you should say, thank you, Henry, because he is the brainchild of all of this. But he determined two different ways of preserving battlefields. One is to go in, buy everything, which, they did at Chickamauga. Shiloh, relatively that at Gettysburg, mostly that at Vicksburg, a little bit of hybrid and all that. But the alternate way of doing this thing became known as the Antietam Plan. You may have heard of the Antietam Plan, where you just go in, and particularly in areas that are so rural and farm areas and all that, you don't need to buy the whole battlefield because it's never going to be urbanized. Sharpsburg's never going to grow, and it's never going to get out of the descendants of these people who owned it during the battle. And so all we'll do is just buy strips of land along roadways, and we'll mark things there, just a very small output of money to preserve these areas because it's going to remain rural. Now, what we found out is a lot of those areas don't remain rural, and we have had to go back and basically do the original plan at these Antietam Plan battlefields like Antietam and other places. But here's my beef with that, why it's called the Antietam Plan. Antietam was also established in 1890, but Chickamauga had already been established with Boynton's plan of doing Chattanooga the way that Chattanooga is done, basically along the road lines, and it's basically the Antietam Plan. So I have argued endlessly, and nobody will listen, but it shouldn't be called the Antietam Plan, it should be called the Chattanooga Plan, because that's where it's laid out first, and that's where it takes first effect, and Antietam is just a bunch of copycats. So next time you're in a meeting with the Antietam superintendent, you tell him you copied us, and we don't like it named after you. Anyway, that's just a little more detail about the Chickamauga-Chattanooga parts here. But Chattanooga, absolutely beautiful. Shiloh, absolutely beautiful. We get into, I don't want to say second-tier battlefields, but in terms of chronology, it's certainly second tier, because we don't have, when Congress stopped establishing these battlefields after the 5 in the 1890s, even though they wanted to do, some wanted to do a lot more, they don't restart preserving battlefields until the 1920s. And so we moved from that golden age period to a kind of in-between period between two big epochs of battlefield preservation, the golden age and then the New Deal. And we all know about the New Deal and just throwing money out at left and right, building stuff. But we do get a couple of battlefields in Tennessee in the 1920s. One of those, of course, is Stones River, which you see here. This is the Hazen Monument at Stones River. I'm sure all of you have been to Stones River. It also is a beautiful battlefield. What part of it is preserved in the battlefield? But you talk about a city mushrooming. Anybody been to Murfreesboro lately? I mean, that place has just blown up like crazy, MTSU and all of that. And as a result, a very small percentage of that battlefield is actually preserved there. But fortunately, in the 1920s, Congress did pass legislation to create the Stones River National Battlefield. They appointed a commission, just like the older 1890s battlefields. They had a commission of veterans, but how old are these veterans in 1928, 27, whenever this is, 1927, I believe. You're talking in their 80s, if not 90s. And they just, I mean, you can't do much work when you're in your early 90s to go out in the woods and preserve places. How many veterans could come back and mark specific places? Now, there's some still, there's some very active 90-year-old people that can get out and do stuff, but the vast majority probably aren't going to have the stamina to get out and do what's needed to mark these places. So that's why the urbanization is taking place. The veterans have passed off the scene, and so the window of opportunity had largely passed, and we get, as a result, smaller, less marked battlefields like Stones River. Still wonderful that it's preserved, what little of it is preserved, but it's not as well marked, not quite the same as Shiloh. If you had an ancestor at Stones River, you're going to have probably a pretty hard time going and finding specifically, certainly a monument or something there, where that unit fought. Nevertheless, Hazen Monument, it is very historic. It is the oldest intact, extant monument on its original site from the Civil War. It was put up in, I believe, the summer of 1863, after the battle in late 1862, named after William Hazen, of course, Union Brigade commander. So, Stones River, very important. We also get, in 1928, Stones River's 1927, 1928, we get Fort Donelson. Who's been to Fort Donelson? That's a wonderful, wonderful site. And you see the river batteries here, looking up the, or actually down the Cumberland, that's downstream there. Fort Donelson was established in 1928, very similar story. You had a commission of veterans, but they were all 80, 90 years old. Couldn't do a lot to mark the sites. A lot of this is done along the lines of the Antietam Plan, or the Chattanooga Plan, it should be called. In fact, the vast majority of the Fort Donelson battlefield, where the actual fighting took place, was not contained in the park. And since then, the American Battlefield Trust and others have been buying up a lot of that land and trying to get it preserved. But Fort Donelson, very similar in this kind of interim period to Stones River. Now, as we move on, we get into the other big epoch of battlefield preservation. That's the New Deal, and that's when the federal government just threw money out in bucket loads, on this and that and everything in the world. The only one that we really get established during this time period, though, is Cumberland Gap. Anybody been to Cumberland Gap? And you're wondering, okay, what happened at Cumberland Gap? Well, there wasn't a huge battle that occurred there, nothing like Chickamauga or Chattanooga or Shiloh or anything like that. But because it was a transportation route, it was very important. Armies moved through there. There were Civil War fortifications there. There was a little bit of fighting around there. But it's mainly a thoroughfare back and forth into East Tennessee and out of East Tennessee. Actually, Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee marched through the Cumberland Gap on the way back from Kentucky. The Kentucky campaign in the fall of 1862, they come back through the Cumberland Gap. So it is significant in historic areas there. Now, as we move on, that's really the only major one, or only one we're going to talk about in the New Deal era. But as we move on, the next real era that we see is the Centennial time period. How many of you remember the Centennial? How many of you bought Bruce Catton's Centennial History of the Civil War and the little hand-drawn maps? Don't you love that? Well, 1961 to 65 was the Centennial of the Civil War. A lot of preservation took place there, tied to the reburst of interest in the Civil War. Unfortunately, by that point, the federal government had largely gotten out of the preservation business. For one, they had already preserved a bunch of battlefields. In the 1920s, for instance, it's not the two in Tennessee are Fort Donelson and Stones River, but Petersburg, Manassas, several of those, Richmond, a lot of those were established during this time period and in the New Deal time period. And as a result, you've already established a bunch of the major battlefields, so there's not that many to establish anymore. They also are getting out of the money business, quit appropriating so much money for these parks and all that. So what we see around the Centennial is a shift to more local preservation, particularly state parks. Now, we see the rise of the state park systems. Tennessee just celebrated, well, not just, but 5, 10, whatever years ago. Anybody state park folks here? I believe it was their 75th anniversary of Tennessee state parks, just a couple of, am I on the right track with that? Which would have put the establishment in the 1920s or 1930s. I can't remember the exact numbers. But we see the rise of state parks, and so we see a lot of those in the 1960s, around the Centennial, early 1950s, a little bit before. Don't see a lot of that in Tennessee so much. We will, however, in the next time period that you leave the Centennial time period up until basically 1990. I call it the Dark Ages because there's just not a lot of preservation work being done. What work is being done is more theoretical in nature. We get all these laws passed to protect things that you're not really protecting physically. For instance, the National Historic Preservation Act and the Archaeological Resources Protection, all those acronyms, those alphabet soup acronyms that the federal government uses that creates, the state entities like the State Historic Preservation Officer and all that. All those are done post-centennial, and that's kind of the theoretical idea of preservation rather than the actual on-the-ground idea of preservation. Now, that said, we do get a couple of sites in Tennessee preserved during these Dark Ages period. That is over at Johnsonville on the Tennessee River. Anybody been to Johnsonville? Just directly across the river is Nathan Bedford Forest State Park. There's some Civil War action there. Johnsonville, some of it when the Tennessee was dammed up, it was lost, but there's a battle at Johnsonville. It was a logistical staging area during that time period. That's a cool picture. If that cannon could be touched off there, I bet that boat captain would bet he'd veer one way or the other. Anyway, at any rate, it's at Johnsonville. It's a wonderful little site there. We also get another state park out at Fort Pillow. Anybody been to Fort Pillow? This is you folks over here in East Tennessee. That's a long way. Of course, you can drive forever almost in Tennessee. Not quite like Texas, but you can drive forever in Tennessee. But this is way over on the Mississippi River, way over in West Tennessee. And it's off the beaten path. You can't get there unless you're really planning to go there, and you have to go by a state penitentiary to get there. So that's a little bit daunting there. But when you look at the history of Fort Pillow, of course, it's one of the original Confederate fortifications defending the Mississippi River, but it was given up very quickly. It is later attacked in 1864 by Nathan Bedford Forrest, and then we get the big argument and debate over whether it was a massacre of black troops and all of that. We're not here to debate all that. We're here to talk about the preservation of the site, which comes in, I think, 1969. Yeah, 1969. Johnsonville, 1969. Fort Pillow, also 1969. Although it took a little while to get up and running. I think Fort Pillow opens in like 1979. Sadly states, before we get into the more modern era where we have entities like the Tennessee Historical Commission or the Tennessee Civil War Preservation Association, all of those, there was, particularly in the South, these southern states weren't real interested in appropriating a whole lot of money to preserve these battlefields, especially the ones where the South got beat, right? Why would you want to preserve some of those? So there's less of these state parks, and there's less resources for state parks than there is the National Park Service. I mean, we know the federal government's a larger entity and has a lot of money to throw away, basically, and as we saw in the New Deal. But national parks, we could do a study. I don't know this I haven't looked it up, but I would guess national parks are a little better funded and have a little more resources behind them. They have the regional offices and Southeast Archaeological Resource Center, the archaeologists at their disposal, all of that, and state parks don't have quite that entity. As a result, we don't have quite the history. When I was doing the study, the book on all battlefield preservation, state, federal, all of that, it's interesting. I would go to the national parks, and I went to all of these major national parks and did research at the actual parks, and each one has a archive. Each national park has their own archive where they have their founding, documents and letters between the commissioners and all that. I spent a lot of time with Jim Ogden up at Chickamauga there, looking through their archives and their original records from their commission, from the founding and all of that. What I found when I went to the state parks, and this certainly is not just Tennessee or even primarily Tennessee, is elsewhere, but I would call up, and I couldn't go to every single state park, all over from, Florida to Picacho Peak in Arizona. I just couldn't fund that type of research. But I would call a lot of them or email, and I did find that a lot of the state parks were interested in their preservation history, how they were founded, when they were founded, and some had even done some work and had some documents and all of that. And I found basically it was the level of interest in the park's history related to the level of interest in the parks superintendent or historian, whatever how interested in the powers that be were, ever how interested they were, is how much documentation they had. I called some state parks, none in Tennessee, I think mostly Louisiana and Arkansas. We can talk about Arkansas all we want to, right? No offense, Arkansas folks, but I got a brother that lives in Arkansas. Y'all know what the new state motto of Arkansas is? Literacy ain't everything. I'm kidding, that's not right. Anyway, all right, we're not here to disparage Arkansas. All right, no more jokes, I promise. Seriously, I do have a brother who lives in Arkansas. But I would call some of these state parks and I would say, hey, I'm working on a book on preservation. I would like some information on how, when your park was established, some documentation, anything you can send me. No, we don't have anything like that. Nothing? No, we don't have anything. We got a golf course, though. Okay, well, I'm not interested in the golf course, but you don't have anything about even a brochure or something when you were established? Give me a date. No, we got we got cabins for rent, though. Would you like a cabin? No, I don't want a cabin. I don't want to play golf. I want some history here. But, that was fairly few and far between. But, the state parks just aren't able to do on the level of the National Park Service. That said, Tennessee has some very beautiful state parks, some really, really well-done state parks, and a couple of them are Civil War battlefields like Fort Pillow and Johnsonville there. Okay, all right, as we move on from the Dark Ages, when there's not a lot of effort at preservation whatsoever, we move into a better and brighter period. What followed the Dark Ages in history? The Enlightenment, the Renaissance, either one of those that you want to talk about. Well, that happens in battlefield preservation as well. And starting about 1990, it has a lot to do with the Ken Burns thing, the re-interest in Americans due to Ken Burns, the 125th anniversary of the battles, all of that. What we start to see is not only the continuation of the hands-off approach by the federal government. They're not preserving much of anything now, especially during the Dark Ages. And even the state parks have started preserving much. We do get a couple of Tennessee ones here, but by and large across the nation, state parks even aren't even doing much then. So it falls to individual entities to start doing the preservation. And it's no coincidence that Will Green meets with who all at Arbuckle's restaurant there in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and creates the most hideous name I've ever heard in my life, the AWCPTBGES, what, I don't know what all it means. APCWS. It had some convoluted name, I guess, but y'all must have been really tired by the time y'all got to the point of name. A committee. A committee. I said no more jokes, but y'all have heard this joke. You know what a camel is, don't you? A horse that was put together by a committee. So that's basically how we get. But that committee did something great, and it became the American, what is today, it's gone through several different names, Civil War Preservation Trust, Civil War Trust, now it's the American Battlefield Trust because they're encompassing Revolutionary War, War of 1812, all of that as well. So what you folks did that night at that restaurant has had huge effects on our preservation because it has moved from the governmental agency to the private agency, and we see several ways that has impacted here in Tennessee. For instance, this is Parker's Crossroads. Anybody been to Parker's Crossroads? Cool little battle. Unfortunately, it's right in the middle of an interstate. Why they fought it in the middle of an interstate? You get run over. I don't know why you do that. But unfortunately, the interstate transected the battlefield. But on each side of the interstate, there is a wonderful little park that was started by the local inhabitants there right around Parker's Crossroads. And ultimately, they formed a commission, an association, and they bought up land, and they just did extremely good work there. And since then, the National Park Service has taken note, and now some of you Park Service folks could help me out on this. It's now what do you call, what's the word, an affiliated site of the National Park Service. It gives it some legitimacy, and they've put up waysides and fences and walking trails, and it's a wonderful, you can walk for miles and miles and miles around that little battlefield. It's a wonderful, wonderful little site, but it was done by local people doing what the government no longer was doing. Another is the Battle of Hatchie Bridge, or better known as Davis Bridge. If you've been to this one, you are a dedicated Civil War battlefield trumper. This one's out in the middle of nowhere in West Tennessee. It's the Hatchie River. It's part of the Corinth campaign when Van Dorn's army is marching away from Corinth after its defeat there in October of 1862. They try to get away across the Hatchie River there. There was a bridge there, Davis Bridge, and a lot of fighting on both sides there, but you can go right down to the river where the bridge was and see the ground that's described and all that. That was begun by a local group in that general area that included some Sons of Confederate veterans, some local preservationists, all that, and they worked and they worked and they preserved and they preserved, and now this has been turned over. The Civil War Battlefield Trust American Battlefield Trust is aided in all this, and now it's been turned over to the National Park Service and is part of Shiloh National Military Park. So local grassroots preservation can work. It can do great large things, and it's very very well done. You know what they can do. A couple of other sites, I bet you know what that is. Fort Negley in Nashville. Anybody been to Fort Negley? That's a cool little site. It's one of the fortifications. It was not actually a battle. It was one of the fortifications ringing Nashville, but it is preserved now. It was started. Actually, the preservation effort goes all the way back to like 1928. But it's one of those stories, and it's a sad story in preservation, and it particularly happens with fortifications and buildings. And I've seen it over and over and over where somebody gets some money to rehabilitate this building or this fort, and everybody's all excited. We're going to do it. We're going to get it spick and span and put trails in, all that kind of stuff, and everybody's going to come here. And then what happens after a few years? The money runs out and the interest runs out, and it becomes dilapidated again. And then the cycle starts back, and what happens? Somebody appropriates some more money, and let's fix it back up again, and then down, and then fix it up again, and then down. Fort Negley has gone through several of those cycles. But recently, I believe it's Nashville, the city of Nashville, has done a lot of preservation work up there, built a visitor center, and they've really got things going up there, which is wonderful. But it's an example of the local people, the city, and of course the larger entities are involved in as well. One of Tennessee's most, I would say, most awe-inspiring sights. Yeah, you go stand at the Peach Orchard at Shiloh, and that's amazing. You stand on Lookout Mountain at Chattanooga, and that's amazing. But how many of you have been to Franklin and seen the pock marks in the back of that kitchen, or have stood in that wooden building and let the light shine through all of those bullet holes? This faced the battle here, and this is at Carter House. The preservation here, I believe, the Carter House goes back to actually a Tennessee state initiative, Tennessee Historical Commission, like 1950, let me see if I've got a date on it, 1953, I believe, is when it was first established, but it was not a state park. It was kind of established and built up by the Tennessee Historical Commission and then handed off to local people to kind of run it. Now, since then, of course, they have done wonders. Anybody involved in the preservation at Franklin? They have done wonders up there, and a lot of the little different entities have come together into one movement, and they change names every once in a while. It was Franklin's Charge at one point. It's Franklin, what is it? I can't remember what it actually, maybe still Franklin's Charge. But anyway, they're all pulling in the same direction now, and they've got Carter House and Carton and a lot of those areas that they're preserving and doing some good work. And, you know, vicious little battle there at Franklin, and you see the pock marks there and the bullet holes in the Carter House, and hear the stories about the son Carter that was wounded, you know, grew up there and wounded as the army came back and died, I believe, in his bedroom. Is that the story? I can't remember, but he died right there in the house. So, you know, they're doing some really good work, and I'll go ahead and finish with this. Tricia, I admit I have no idea what time it is. I may be way over time, but we can. I guess we're going to take questions after this. We can do some questions, but I'll just finish up with kind of looking in the future a little bit, and I think the way of the future is being pointed at Franklin, because yeah, we've established a lot of battlefields. We've got the major ones in Tennessee and a lot of minor ones, and the Tennessee Civil War Preservation Association doing good work on a lot of those different fields. The American Battlefield Trust is at work on a lot of these different fields, the big ones and the small ones. And so as we think about what has been preserved in the past, we're getting, you know, we're doing a fairly good job. We've preserved a lot of, particularly the big stuff. But what happens in the future when this urbanization has taken over and, you know, a lot of the pristine battlefield has been ruined? Do we just stop and say, okay, well, we won't fool with that. It's damaged goods. We're not gonna fool with it anymore. At Franklin, they have started the process of what? Rehabilitation. And so at Carton, right north of Carton, where the Confederate charge moved through, used to be a golf course. And lo and behold, they go in there and they take that golf course out and they turn it back into what it would have looked like. The Domino's Pizza, where Claiborne was killed at the Cotton Gin. It's now the Claiborne Park. You know, they've got a little monument there that denotes Claiborne's death, and I believe the foundation of the Cotton Gin, all of that. Starting to rehabilitate. Is that just as good as the original pristine stuff? Well, maybe not in a technical sense, but you can rehabilitate it to the point that it looks the same. You don't really know much difference unless you lop off the top of a mountain or something. If you come in and lop off the top of Lookout Mountain, that's going to be a preservation no-no, and I don't see that happening. But you know, you can rehabilitate, and we see this. The American Battlefield Trust now has initiatives not just to purchase land and preserve land, but also when they purchase some of this land to rehabilitate it, right? To remove a hotel that sat at Gettysburg, or to remove a mini golf, putt-putt golf place, or to remove the Domino's Pizza that was at the Carter Gin at Franklin. So I think that is the way of the future. We're still going to do the major preservation stuff in the Park Service and the Trust and the Tennessee Preservation Association. They're all doing good work, but at some point, you know, we have to look at the stuff that's already been damaged and reclaim that and rehabilitate it. And that, I think, is a major initiative in the future of preservation. But I'll just end with this. It's all our jobs to do this. It's you know, just leave it to the Preservation Trust or the Tennessee folks or the state legislature or the Tennessee Historical Commission or whoever. It's all of our jobs. And if you're not a member, and they don't pay me to say this or anything like that, but if you're not a member of the American Battlefield Trust or the Tennessee Civil War Preservation Association or the Friends of Chickamauga, Chattanooga, what are you, the National Park Partners of Chickamauga, Chattanooga National Military Park, join these things. They can use your volunteer hour work. They can use your money. They can use a lot of different things because they are doing good work supporting these national parks and state parks and other entities. They're doing good work. So get involved and help carry on this legacy of preservation that we have seen here in Tennessee. Thank you very much for having me. And we got time for questions, I guess.
If you have a question, raise your hand and we'll try to get the mic to you so everyone can hear you well.
Yes, when I lived in Virginia during the 70s, I visited many of the Civil War battle sites. And one of the things that kept coming up over and over again was the restriction on building heights around the field so as to preserve what it actually looked like. Is that still in effect?
I am not totally sure about that because what you're describing is more of an urban situation, I promise you, there is no building tall enough to restrict any site at Shiloh. There are hardly buildings at Shiloh. So probably what you're talking about is Northern Virginia, that area, Fredericksburg, Manassas, and all that. And I'm not really sure up there. I don't know if there are stipulations. My guess would be it would be local zoning ordinances, and dealing with the zoning boards and the supervisors and all that is an absolute headache that the Battlefield Trust is constantly in battle with them. And so I don't know specifically off the top of my head any zoning ordinances that a building cannot be a certain height. I'm not sure about that. I do know there are here and there discussions about maybe build, and the famous tower at Gettysburg, that thing sticking up right in the middle of Gettysburg on Cemetery Hill there. There is some discussion about whether there should be a cell tower in this certain area right on the battlefield, right near the battlefield of Shiloh, that's going to affect everybody's vision and all that. So it plays out in a lot of different ways other than just building. I'm not familiar with anything specifically about buildings, but I know it does extend to towers and other things as well. And even, light poles and all that. When I was at Shiloh 25 years ago, there was a movement to bury all the power lines underground, which helps with the aesthetic view. But then you've got a bunch of green boxes on the side of the road that you've got to make look like rocks or something, even though there are no rocks at Shiloh. So anyway, that I can't specifically answer about buildings. The question was, virtually all Civil War parks have period cannons, Civil War cannons. And yes, the vast majority of those are Civil War ordnance that basically had sat in arsenals for 30 years after the Civil War. You think about it, they're mass produced in the Civil War, and once that's over and the federal armies, of course, the Confederate armies downsized after the war as well, but the federal armies downsized, and you go back to a very small military, so you don't need all these guns, so they just place them in arsenals. Well, after 30 years, these old Civil War cannons where you poke the ball and all that down the barrel, these are obsolete. Now you have breech loading and all of that, so they're not any good anyway, except to commemorate things. And so once the parks start coming along, hey, yeah, we'll send 250 to Shiloh or 300 to Chickamauga or whatever, and we'll use them, as monumentation. And I don't recall off the top of my head about Chickamauga, but I know the vast majority, if not all, of the guns at Shiloh were brought by steamboat on the Tennessee River there, ultimately from the Watervley U.S. Arsenal in, I believe, Albany, New York, is where a lot of the cannon that were, do what? Watervliet, is that how you say it? Did I say it wrong? I redneck everything up, but. Oh, yeah. They're still owned today, even by the federal government. Sure, yeah, at the discretion of the originally the War Department. Now, what I didn't go into, I could talk about 10,000 battles and all this all night, but one thing I didn't go into, originally these battlefields were under the War Department, and of course it doesn't take as much paperwork to move guns within the War Department from one entity to another. When you start moving guns from the Army to the National Park Service in a completely different agency, that's when you get in a lot of paperwork and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, they were always federal government owned, and still even today. So that's the story of how they came about.
Oh, Vicki, I'm coming.
Yeah, there seems to be quite an effort going on in renaming military posts in the South that were in honor of certain Confederate generals, officers, et cetera, and in public municipal places. And I'm wondering if there's still a serious balance within the Park Service towards looking at both the Union and the Confederate side of things, and just whether there's any interplay between those two forces.
Step counter.
Yeah, obviously, we don't want to get into current politics here, but yes, there is a movement afoot in some of the agencies to rename sites and forts and all that kind of stuff. I'm proud to say within the National Park Service, I have seen absolutely nothing. I'm not with the Park Service anymore. I'm not in the inner circles and all that. But as from what I've seen no whatever attempt to remove anything in terms of the Park Service. And it would be a travesty if it was. Whether that's coming or not, I don't know. As our society and culture shifts and moves, and I think we're all on quicksand at this point. But I don't know what's coming. But I would find it very, very difficult to believe that the Park Service eventually one day will remove something historic. And it's not just commemorating something historic. By this point, the monuments and guns and tablets and all that are at Chickamauga and Shiloh, they're well over 100 years old. They're historic in and of themselves. That's a historic artifact. So to move some of that, it would be a travesty, but fortunately I have heard absolutely nothing of that. The closest thing would be this initiative to interpret the causes of the Civil War at each national park, but that's in addition to rather than the removal of it. Would you like to comment on this, or you rather? Okay, he says that's accurate. We got thumbs up from the superintendent. So.
This could be political too. The black community is a direct, I would say, the genesis, the Civil War. After the Civil War, the black community became the genesis, where the black soldiers became the genesis of the African American community. The 44th and 42nd were organized here, and they fought. I know the 44th fought in Nashville, at the Battle of Nashville, and according to themselves very well. 42nd basically did a lot of the work around Chattanooga. They built a national park. They did other things as well. Some of them worked in the large commissary that was, downtown, and developed a lot of skills that they were able to use in their after that. But what parks across the country still have a significant history of the black soldiers who fought?
There is a very rich history of United States colored troops, of African-American troops that were involved in many of these campaigns. Now, a lot of them in Tennessee that we've talked about this early in the war in Shiloh and Fort Donelson. There's not a lot there. We mentioned the debate over the massacre at Fort Pillow. And going back to even when it was established, I found a lot of letters back and forth about this side and that side and all that. But some other campaigns had a very rich history of African-American soldiers. I think specifically of Vicksburg. I've had Vicksburg on the brain for the last several years. There were numerous African-American USCT troops involved in that, not in the siege itself, but over across the river at Milliken's Bend. Port Hudson, just down the river as well. And actually, I believe it was 2004, they erected a USCT memorial at Vicksburg. You've been down there to see the monument to the USCT troops at Vicksburg. And so I think that's very fitting. At Petersburg, that Will deals with particularly the crater, but elsewhere, I believe, is another example. So, the 54th Massachusetts and Charleston and all that. So, yes, there's a lot of rich history of USCT troops. I think the story is not fully told as of yet. I think there's more to be told, and there's academics working on it. I know the Park Service is working on some of this. So it's a developing story that needs to be told, and I think as we continue this preservation process, it will continue to come out. Okay.
You mentioned the massacre at Fort Pillar in Memphis. There's some research that said a similar occurrence happened in Dalton, Georgia. Do you know anything about that?
I do not know anything about the Dalton, Georgia. Was that in the Atlanta campaign, or Will, do you know anything? After Atlanta or in occupation. Okay, I don't know anything about that. The bigger ones, of course, are Fort Pillow and Petersburg, the crater, and those.
I think we'll take one more question, and then we can adjourn to the lobby. Do you mind coming down from the back? Just kidding.
Hopefully a softball question for you. Of the different states and how they've gone about preserving battlefields, is there one or a few that you feel have done a better job throughout their history of preserving battlefields?
Just off the top of my head, I immediately go to the abysmal ones, and Mississippi just hasn't done a very good job in terms of its, state preservation. It's only now that we're starting to see some state historical markers go up to different things. But for many years there, and I'm more familiar with Mississippi, that's where I grew up. It was few and far between to see any historical markers, state historical markers, particularly at somewhere where the Confederacy was defeated. Some victory or something, they'd put markers all over the place. But even in the ones that they did put up, the language was so tainted and one-sided kind of thing, that's not a good example. I think Georgia's doing a good job now. Virginia, if you heard in the news, Virginia just created a new state park. I believe it's Culpeper Battlefield State Park, and other places in Virginia. I should have mentioned Pamplin Park. Will was involved in Pamplin Park as part of this private organizational thing in the Renaissance period. But I'll have to say Tennessee has done a good job as well, particularly with its Preservation Association and a few of these state parks and other entities. Tennessee has done, we'll say, much better than Mississippi and much better than a lot of other states, and they've done a wonderful job. So.
Thank you so much. Well, I promise I didn't tell him to say all that great stuff about preserving, but just in case you didn't know, National Park Partners is currently filling that role. A lot of our partnerships are with the American Battlefield Trust, but we are currently owning and holding the Browns Ferry Landing, the site of the Battle of Browns Ferry, as well as Browns Ferry Tavern, built around 1803 as the witness structure to the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail, and the sort of precursor events leading up to the Battle of Lookout Mountain and the other battles for Chattanooga. We also recently took ownership of a 103-acre property at Reed's Bridge Road, just shy of Chickamauga Battlefield. Did you know that the original letter asked for 7,000 acres at Chickamauga, and they got 5,000? And one of the places that was left out was, did I just tell the historian something? That one of the places that was left out was the site of the very first shots of the Battle of Chickamauga at Reed's Bridge Road. So now National Park Partners owns that property until it can be included through an act of Congress into the boundary of Chick-Chat. But there's information about all of that and all of our programs out front. Greg, let me borrow your flyer. If you haven't already gotten one of these in the mail or picked one up on the table, this has the remaining lecture series events coming up on October 14th. We didn't quite have time to get it reprinted. We just found out last week that unfortunately Jay Hanna is not going to be able to travel, but Chief Chus Hoskin of the Cherokee Nation is planning to be here for the conference anyway, so he's going to do the keynote. That's kind of a big deal. That's Chief of a Sovereign Nation coming to the Moccasin Bend Lecture Series. It's pretty special. So sign up. That one's going to be across the street in the IMAX, and I promise you even the 400 seats of the IMAX will fill up for that. So if you haven't already registered, do that. And then November 4th, we're going to look toward the holidays and remember Civil War Christmases with the American Civil War Museum in Richmond. Their museum educator is going to come and do that. So without further ado, thank you all again for coming, and hope you have safe travels home, and we'll see you for the rest of the series.